The collapse begins in silence. They thought they would walk away untouched, maybe even stronger, unbothered. That's the illusion people carry when they move through life emotionally armored, when their defense mechanisms have worked for so long that they start to mistake them for strength. But pain has a strange way of finding its way in, not through the wounds they expect, but through the ones they didn't even know were there. They prepared for the fight. They rehearsed the goodbye. They even braced for the loss. But what eventually broke them wasn't any of that. It was what came later, quiet, unannounced, and utterly disarming. Because the people who hurt the most aren't always the ones left behind. Sometimes it's the ones who leave that end up shattered. But not right away. They move on fast. Or so it seems. They act like nothing happened. They thrive in their solitude, convinced they made the right choice. They fill their time, their bed, their feed, and still, something starts to slip. Not loudly, not dramatically, but gradually, like a dull ache beneath skin that once felt impenetrable. The truth is, people don't break in the moment they say goodbye. They break in the echo that follows, in the silence that lingers long after the noise fades. And for those who've spent their lives avoiding vulnerability, that silence is deafening. Because here's what they never saw coming. You were the mirror, the calm in their chaos, the person who saw through the act and stayed anyway. And that kind of presence, that kind of love, it doesn't just disappear when they walk away. It haunts them, not because you begged them to stay, but because you didn't. Not because you fell apart when they left, but because you didn't crumble like they expected. They were prepared for drama. They were ready for guilt tripping, for tears, for chaos, but you gave them peace. And that's what broke them. Because peace is unbearable to someone who only feels alive in dysfunction. You didn't react, you responded. You didn't chase, you let them go. You didn't make it about punishment. You made it about self-respect. And that is the one thing they never trained for. People don't fall apart when you yell. They fall apart when you remain calm. They don't unravel when you cling. They unravel when you release. It's the stillness that confronts them, the quiet that echoes louder than any fight, the absence that forces them to sit with themselves, without you there to soothe, to explain, to distract. They thought detachment would save them. They thought they'd win by walking away first. But they forgot the cost of walking away from someone who never intended to harm them, someone who would have stayed, if only they'd let you in. And now, what breaks them isn't losing you. It's realizing you were never trying to break them in the first place. You were just trying to love them, patiently, consistently, softly. And that is what undoes them in the end. Not the fight, not the fallout, but the kindness they can no longer reach. The moment they realize you were the only person who saw their pain and chose not to run from it, even when they ran from you. And now, the door they slammed shut doesn't just lock from the outside. It locks from the inside too. They're alone, not because no one wanted to stay, but because they couldn't believe anyone would. They weren't afraid of being hurt. They were afraid of being loved, in a way that made them responsible for their own healing. And when you left without malice, when you disappeared not to punish but to protect your peace, they finally felt the one thing they thought they could avoid forever: regret. And it didn't scream. It didn't break through the door. It whispered. You didn't have to say anything. Your absence said it all. They thought you'd wait forever. They thought they had time. Time to come back. Time to fix what they silently unraveled. Time to rewrite the ending, if it came to that. Because people like them, the ones who retreat first, the ones who ghost, disappear, detach, they don't say goodbye because they're sure it's over. They say goodbye because they assume you'll still be there when they're ready to return. So they leave, quietly, sometimes cruelly, but always with the silent hope that this is just a pause, not a final chapter. And maybe you once believed that too. Maybe you once kept the door open, even after they stopped knocking. Maybe a part of you held out, believing that if they just understood, if they just healed, if they just woke up, they'd finally come back right. But something shifted, not in them, in you. You stopped needing closure. You stopped needing explanations. You stopped needing to carry the emotional burden of someone who always walked half out the door, even while claiming to be in. And you didn't slam the door shut. You just stopped waiting near it. And that's the moment they didn't see coming. They didn't expect you to move forward without bitterness. They didn't expect you to release them without needing revenge. They didn't expect you to love yourself more than you loved the idea of what they could have become, because their entire emotional power rested on one belief: that you'd stay, even if they didn't, that you'd hold space, even if they vacated it, that you'd keep choosing them, even when they refused to fully choose you. But people don't stay stuck forever. Not the ones who truly love. They grieve, they hurt, they heal, and then they rise. And by the time the avoidant turns around, you're no longer standing where they left you. They thought they'd come back to the same version of you, the one who tolerated their distance, who softened in the face of silence, who made excuses for why they couldn't love fully. But you're not that person anymore. You no longer confuse inconsistency with depth. You no longer find hope in breadcrumbs. You no longer believe that love should feel like waiting to be enough. And now what breaks them isn't just your absence, it's your growth. Because growth is proof that they were never your source of healing, just your lesson. You were supposed to lose them, not to break you, but to awaken you, to remind you that your love is not something to survive. It's something to be honored, held, protected, reciprocated. And now that you know that, now that you've tasted the peace that comes from no longer chasing clarity from someone incapable of giving it, they can feel it too. They feel the shift. The disconnection they once craved has turned against them. The space they created has now become a wall they can't climb. Not because you blocked them, but because you outgrew needing them. And that's what breaks them. Not the loss of your presence, but the loss of your hope. Because once hope dies, they no longer have access to the most powerful part of you, your belief that they could change. You loved them at their most unlovable. You stayed longer than most would. You held them with grace, even as they let go. But grace doesn't mean passivity. Compassion doesn't mean self-abandonment. And love, real love, has boundaries. And you finally remembered yours. You no longer beg to be chosen. You no longer audition for affection. You no longer break yourself into pieces just to make someone else feel whole. They thought the final blow would be losing you. But the truth is, the final blow is realizing you're never coming back. Not because you're angry, but because you've finally healed. And there's nothing more terrifying to someone who lives in cycles than encountering someone who has broken free. They always assumed you were the emotionally dependent one, the one who couldn't live without them, the one who would always keep the door cracked. But what they never expected, what they never prepared for, was the version of you who stopped waiting. The version who realized that just because someone feels like home doesn't mean they're a safe place to live. And now you've moved on. Not bitter, not broken, just free. The moment they realize you're really gone, there's a strange silence that follows real closure. Not the kind they controlled, the kind you gave to yourself. It's the kind that doesn't come with door slams or emotional fireworks. It doesn't scream, "I'm done." It doesn't chase. It simply lets go, quietly, fully, and finally. And for someone who's always thrived in emotional ambiguity, that silence is not just unsettling, it's disorienting. They were used to your warmth. Even when they pulled away, they were used to your reach. Even when they stayed out of touch, they were used to the safety net of your love. Always beneath them, always there. But something shifted in the silence. Not a punishment, not a game, just a quiet reclaiming of your own peace. And that's when it hits them, not all at once, but in waves. A song you used to love comes on, and they skip it. Too familiar, too raw. They tell themselves it's nothing, but their stomach tightens when your name appears in an old message, thread they'd forgotten to delete. And suddenly, you're not a memory, you're a presence. Not because you're physically there, but because now your absence has weight. They once needed space. Now, they're swallowed by it. Because when you walked away, you didn't just leave. You took your emotional availability with you. You took your belief in them, your patience with them, your forgiveness of them, and you placed it back where it always should have been, within yourself. And that's what they never saw coming. They thought the danger was in losing you physically. They never considered the real threat was losing your emotional access to them. The part of you that used to care if they were okay. The part of you that used to check on them. The part of you that still wanted to fix things even after being broken by them. Because the moment you stopped doing that, the moment you stopped holding their emotional weight, is the moment they started to feel the gravity of it themselves. And avoidants don't do well with gravity. They fear weight. They fear emotional closeness. Because they were never taught how to carry it without collapse. So they run. They withdraw. They detach. But here's the secret they don't tell you. They don't detach because they don't feel. They detach because they feel too much and don't know what to do with it. And now, without your emotional presence softening the edges of their pain, they're finally sitting with it. All of it. The guilt they buried. The longing they denied. The recognition of what they destroyed. Not because you were too much, but because they never believed they were enough. And here's the truth no one talks about. They left not because they stopped caring, but because caring felt like drowning to someone who never learned how to swim in emotional waters. But now they're underwater, alone, not because you pushed them there, but because you stopped reaching in to rescue them. And they're gasping, not for you, but for the safety they lost when they lost your trust. Because at one point, they could have had all of you. The kind of love that heals. The kind of love that's rare. The kind of love that's willing to meet you in your darkest hour. Not to fix you, but to sit with you in it. But they mistook that love for emotional pressure. They mistook connection for control. They mistook presence for expectation. So they pushed it away, told themselves it was too much, told themselves they needed space. And now space is all they have. But space doesn't hold them at night. It doesn't send thoughtful messages. It doesn't look at them like they're still worth loving even when they feel unworthy. And now, in the cold quiet of their own detachment, they're faced with something far more painful than your anger. Your indifference. Not because you don't care, but because you've accepted that caring isn't enough when you're the only one showing up. That's what breaks them. Not the moment you left, but the moment you stopped emotionally fighting. For someone who refused to fight for themselves, they expected you to keep proving your love, to keep coming back with open arms, to keep rescuing them from their own emotional avoidance. But you finally realized you were never the problem. You were just the mirror, and they ran, not from you, but from the version of themselves they saw in your reflection. Because you loved them in a way that exposed their fears. You loved them in a way that made them feel seen and being seen. Scared them more than being alone. So they chose the discomfort of distance over the vulnerability of love. And now, Now they sit in that distance, realizing too late that no amount of space can recreate the safety they once had in you. Because safety wasn't the silence. It was your voice. It was your presence. It was your forgiveness. And most of all, it was your willingness to stay. But even the most loyal hearts have a threshold. And once crossed, there's no returning to the version of you that was still waiting to be chosen. Now, you've chosen yourself. And that's what breaks them in the end. Not the loss of your love, but the realization that while they were busy avoiding intimacy, you were becoming someone who would never again beg to be understood. When control becomes their cage, there comes a moment in every avoidance life when the silence they once weaponized begins to echo. At first, it felt like safety, control, a return to solitude, their oldest companion. But solitude, in its truest form, isn't a refuge. It's a mirror, and eventually, they have to look into it. And what they see staring back isn't peace. It's the ghost of everything they ran from. Not just you, but themselves. Because when you stop reaching out, when you no longer respond to the subtle breadcrumbs they drop to test the waters, when even your silence feels indifferent instead of emotionally charged, that's when the illusion breaks. They didn't expect your absence to feel so complete. They didn't think your detachment would be real. They thought you'd always leave a door cracked open, just enough for them to walk back through when it felt safe again. But now, that door isn't locked. It's gone. And for the first time, they understand that they weren't just losing a relationship. They were losing a home. One they never had to build because you built it for both of you. And they walked out of it like it would always be there. Now, there's nothing left but emotional dust. And they're standing in the ruins, trying to piece together a version of you that no longer exists. Because you've grown, you've moved, you've healed, not in a dramatic, vengeful way, but in the quiet way the strongest people do. The kind of healing that doesn't ask for applause. It simply no longer reacts. And it's in that unshakable calm that they feel the panic rise. Because now they're realizing, it wasn't just that you cared, it's that you cared in a way no one else ever did. With grace, with patience, with a belief in their goodness that they themselves could never hold. And now they're left with the uncomfortable truth. That love, it didn't ask for perfection. It only asked for presence. And even that, they couldn't give. Because deep down, they've always feared what true intimacy reveals. They've worn independence like armor, but secretly longed for someone to see through it. And you did. You saw through the silence, through the walls, through the detachment. You saw the wounded child behind the adult performance. And instead of judging, you stayed. You reached. You loved. Not because you were naive, but because you recognized that broken doesn't mean unworthy. It means untaught. It means scared. But they weren't ready to be seen that deeply. Because to them, love was conditional, transactional, earned through performance, not presence. And when you gave it freely, when you gave it just because they existed, they didn't trust it. They didn't trust you. Because love that doesn't require masks, that's terrifying to someone who's only ever survived by hiding. So they pulled away, not because you did anything wrong, but because you did everything right. You showed them what real love looks like, and they convinced themselves they weren't worthy of it. And now, in the void left behind, they replay every moment they dismissed, deflected, or devalued you. The texts they ignored, the vulnerability they mocked, the closeness they sabotaged. It plays on a loop, a silent reel of what could have been. And here's the cruel twist. They'll never fully admit it. They may never reach out to apologize. Their pride, their shame, their wiring, it doesn't always allow for it. But that doesn't mean they don't feel it. It doesn't mean they're not haunted. By the sound of your laughter they took for granted. By the way your eyes softened when you looked at them with love, not judgment. By the way you forgave things they still haven't forgiven in themselves. And now they sit with that. Not for a day, not for a week, but over months, years even. Because once they realize what they lost wasn't attention or affection, but real, rooted, unconditional connection, everything else begins to feel empty. The people they date, they'll compare them to you. The intimacy they find, it'll feel shallow. Not because others aren't worthy, but because they no longer feel capable of meeting love at the depth you did. And here's the irony. All their life, they avoided the kind of intimacy you offered. But now, it's the only kind they crave. Because now they know what it feels like to be fully seen and still loved. And nothing else will satisfy that hunger again. They'll try. They'll fill the silence with noise, with distractions, with shallow connections, half-felt conversations, and emotionally unavailable partners who match their own defenses. But late at night, when the noise fades, and they're left with only themselves, that's when you echo the loudest. Not because you're still there, but because you're not. And that's what begins to undo them. Not your love, but your absence. Because now they realize you weren't the storm, you were the shelter, and they left you out of fear they'd never be enough. Only to discover that without you, they never feel whole. The undoing they never prepared for. You didn't break them. You didn't punish them. You didn't seek revenge. You simply let them face the one thing they weren't prepared for. The consequences of their own disconnection. The truth that silence, when no longer used as a shield, becomes a cage. And they lock themselves inside it, with the key still trembling in their hands. That's the part that cuts deepest. It's not the heartbreak, not the goodbye. It's the quiet realization that the one person they could have been safe with is already gone. Because you stopped arguing, you stopped explaining, you stopped trying to prove your love. And in doing so, you reclaimed something far more powerful than their validation. You reclaimed yourself. See, avoidants don't just fear intimacy. They fear dependency, not on others, but on the feeling of being known, being truly seen. Because once someone sees them, the illusion collapses. The persona, the distance, the coldness they mistook for strength. And you didn't just see through them, you saw into them, into the soft places they covered with sarcasm, into the loneliness they masked with independence, into the longing they shamed themselves for feeling. And they weren't ready, not to be loved like that, not to be held without condition. But you were. You showed up. You stayed present. You bent when they pushed, softened when they snapped, and steadied yourself in the emotional chaos they created until you couldn't anymore. Until it became clear that loving them was costing you your own reflection. And so you did the hardest thing you'll ever do. You loved them by letting them go. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring for yourself. That is what breaks them. Not your silence, but the peace within it. Not your absence, but the fact that you no longer need them to fill it. Because avoidance always assumed they were the ones with the power. The distance gave them control. The emotional detachment made them feel safe. But now they're seeing the truth. Control is empty if there's no one left who wants to be held. Distance is meaningless when the person on the other side stops reaching. And here's the final unraveling. The moment they consider coming back, they'll have to face the version of you that no longer lives in that same place. Because you've changed. You're no longer the one waiting. You're no longer the one aching. You're no longer trying to make sense of their confusion. You've stopped trying to decode mixed signals. You've stopped chasing clarity from someone who profits off your doubt. You've rebuilt. And it shows. not in loud declarations, but in the way your boundaries now speak for you, in the way your energy no longer leans in, but stands tall, in the way you say little and mean everything. And maybe, just maybe, they'll reach out again, but you'll feel it differently this time. Not as a rescue mission, not as a hope, but as a test of your growth. And by then, you'll know. You were never too much. You were never overloving. You were simply offering a level of emotional intimacy they weren't ready to receive. And now, you're done offering it to the undeserving. So if you're watching this and still wondering whether they ever think of you, whether your love left an imprint, whether your absence echoes, let this be your confirmation. They remember not just what you gave, but what they lost. And no amount of denial, detachment, or distraction will ever erase that. But this story isn't theirs anymore. It's yours. You don't need closure. You are the closure. You are the proof that loving deeply doesn't make you weak. It makes you rare. And one day, the right person won't flinch at that depth. They'll meet you there. They'll stay. Until then, keep healing. Keep rising. Keep becoming someone you're proud to come home to. If this spoke to something in you, if it made you feel seen, or finally gave voice to the pain you couldn't put into words, then stay with this channel. We tell the truth here, the kind of truth that hurts at first, but heals in the long run, the kind of truth they were never ready to give you. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and above all, keep choosing yourself, again and again and again, because you're not hard to love. You were just trying to love someone who hadn't yet learned how to stay.